Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Laura Cohen, and I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. We're excited to welcome you to today's program, Criminalization and the Other, featuring Dr. Celia Sporer, Assistant Professor of Criminal Justice at QCC. The Kupferberg Holocaust Center in Bayside, New York, is situated on the traditional land of the Mantinecock people who continue to live here today. We offer gratitude and respect to all of the Indigenous people of Turtle Island, past, present, and future, including the Lenape and Shinnecock peoples. What I just read is what we call a land acknowledgement. This is a statement recognizing that the land we all occupy in the course of our daily lives, including our schools, jobs, parks, and homes, as well as the names of towns and roads, was first inhabited by another group of people who were forcibly expelled and murdered. Today, we identify those crimes for what they are: mass atrocities and genocide. These horrors continue to have devastating political, social, psychological, economic, and environmental impacts upon and within Native American and Indigenous communities. Today's presentation is part of the KHC's 2021 National Endowment for the Humanities Colloquium entitled Incarceration, Transformation, and Paths to Liberation During the Holocaust and Beyond. It's also connected to the Kupferberg Holocaust Center's new exhibition on a related topic, the concentration camps, inside the Nazi system of incarceration and genocide. Now, before we begin, please use the raise hand button on the bottom of your screen if you have any questions. And now to kick things off, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Azadeh Alai. She's faculty fellow of this year's NEH Colloquium and associate professor of psychology at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York. Dr. Alai's current research focuses on Holocaust education, as well as the psychology of bystander behavior during the Holocaust. Her past research interests include the intersection of media, mass violence, warfare, and genocide. She's the author of Understanding Aggression, Psychological Origins and Approaches to Aggressive Behavior, as well as was the scholar in residence for the KHC's 2017 NEH Colloquium. Now it's my pleasure, again, Dr. Alai.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm so excited to be here. I wanted to take this time to introduce our guest speaker for today. I feel particularly fortunate to be able to introduce her as, in addition to being a colleague of mine in our department, she's also my office mate. So Dr. Celia Sporer is going to be speaking with us today. She is a tenure-track professor of criminal justice here at QCC. She has a BA in History and AA in Judaic Studies from Yeshiva University, Stern College for Women, a BA and MA in Forensic Psychology, and a PhD in Criminal Justice with a specialization in Forensic Psychology from the CUNY Graduate Center based at John Jay. Dr. Sporer serves on several committees and actively mentors students and facilitates their research. Additionally, she covers a wide variety of topics, but the majority of her current work is focusing on expanding Holocaust studies in the classroom and issues related to the well-being of first responders. She has aligned her courses with the KHC in the past and has participated in various trainings offered by the KHC, in addition to other Holocaust-focused institutions throughout the United States. She and I actually frequently commiserate in our shared mission of expanding Holocaust education and higher education. So it is really my pleasure and joy to introduce you all to Dr. Celia Sporer.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Dr. Alai. This afternoon, I'm going to talk about, the title of the presentation is The Criminalization and the Other. And this is kind of a little bit of a passion of mine. I have spent a good deal of time trying to expand Holocaust education. As the grandchild of survivors, as somebody who visited the KHC as a child, school trips, this is very close to me, and I am always looking for opportunities to do research, to encourage my students to do research. However, when Dr. Alai approached me to speak as part of this series, I was really kind of at a loss at what to talk about, and I kind of let it go for quite a while. But as with most things, my students kind of influenced my choice of topic. and where I'm going to go with this. Particularly, I guess, a small token of gratitude goes to my criminal justice students who are in Crim 106, which is my research methods class. This class can be a little bit of a boring class. Research methods tends to be a little bit dry and challenging for students, and I try very frequently to make it more interesting by introducing different themes into it. And, as much as I kind of am reluctant to say it a little bit, criminal justice and the Holocaust go hand in hand. Even the terminology kind of goes hand in hand. The term, incarceration, camps, the use of police, the use of courts, justice, there's such an overlap that it's kind of a natural fit. And what I've really been trying to do over these semesters is try to give my students this feel. This semester, I decided to focus on genocide, in part based on a program I did with the U.S. Holocaust Museum over the summer on sort of improving Holocaust education in various disciplines across the board in college settings. And so, I find with many of my students, not just this class, that oftentimes there is a very basic lack of knowledge, not just of the Holocaust, but also in genocide in general. And so the theme for this talk emerged as my students started to ask questions, as my students started to make very insightful comments. Sometimes they don't even realize how insightful their comments are, and how much we start with the Holocaust, but they have a way of bringing it to life. And so I'm going to share my screen with you guys. The first thing, so this basically, the talk emerged out of this thought of genocide and the other, and what does othering mean with my students, and in terms of criminal justice, because that is my area of focus. So kind of before I start, I want to just talk a little bit about the concept of othering. And, we use the word other all the time in conversations with each other, and we talk about being an other. The concept of othering, though, has a little bit more of a formal definition. It's up there. It's generally defined as, treating a person or a group of people as intrinsically different from, different from or alien to oneself, and placing them in a category by the system and society that deems them somehow unworthy of being part of the majority or the mainstream community. It has a lot to do with defining people, not necessarily how people self-define, but how other groups define people, and labeling people as not fitting in with the majority social groups. And this comes up a lot when we talk about different criminal justice topics, because we talk about kind of what's criminal, what's deviant, how people are not necessarily treated as equal in the criminal justice system, but it also very much affects Holocaust and genocide studies. The term othering and this definition of othering affects both the perception of treatment of these groups by individuals and the general public, as well as institutions that work on behalf of the general public. So when we talk about it in terms of criminal justice, we talk about it in terms of how others might react to certain groups, but not just the individual one-on-one interactions, but for example, how police might interact with certain groups, how the courts don't necessarily treat everybody as equal, and that there are certain groups that go through this othering process. And the little picture over there kind of shows that there are different ways of viewing it, from age, sexual orientation, gender identity, skin color, religion, political affiliation, but there's tons of other ways that this plays into the concepts and the institutions that we are really focusing on in criminal justice. And then the other slide there, the other picture on the slide talks about sort of all the things that go hand in hand with othering, things like stereotyping, dehumanization, objectifying, prejudice, discrimination. All of those things are key components that unfortunately go into genocide. And one of the things I try to impart to my students, it's not just about learning the history. It's not just about saying, oh my gosh, that's so sorry. I can't believe that happened. That was horrible. It's about learning the lessons. And so we spend a lot of time talking about this both historically and practically. When individuals belong to a group that are defined as others, they are subject to the othering, and then they therefore will find themselves often excluded, marginalized, controlled, alienated, and victimized, not only physically victimized, which does happen, but also denials of rights, basic human rights that we have come to take for granted here in the United States. And they are, the othering results in a concept of, or interactions that focus on, they are not like me approach. I am who I am, but the other is not like me. And because they are not like me, they maybe don't deserve the same dignity and respect as me and people who are like me. We then get prejudice, we get dehumanization, and inevitably it leads, unless it's checked in different ways, leads to further exploitation and persecution of these groups. And it creates this vicious cycle of othering, because once these groups are now formally victimized or formally discriminated against or formally persecuted by organizations, by institutions, it then represents them again more as others to the average person and to these groups. So the first thing I just want to highlight for you, and this is probably something that most of you are familiar with, having attended different things at the Holocaust Center, but this is the Greg Stanton's 10 stages of genocide. And when I talk to my students in class, this is the first thing we talk about. This is day one's lecture, is we talk about the 10 stages of genocide. And not only we talk about them historically, we talk about practically, we go through them, we define them. We also talk about the notion that if we can identify these stages and we understand the process, that our goal as citizens of the world, our goals as human beings, as just rational, logical people who are just want to be good and do right in the world, we have to work to act in prevention. And it's not just, we can't rely on, somebody else to do it, that we need to be aware of these things. We also talk about the fact that how genocide is not something that suddenly appears out of nowhere without warning, or it's some sort of anomaly that can't be studied. We actually talk about each stage, understand the process by which these horrific acts occur, what each step was. And while each step is horrific in and of itself, the ones that kind of come afterwards almost make it even more horrific. My students and I recently had a conversation about which of these steps is the worst. And the conclusion that most people came to was it's the denial part is the worst. While the actual crimes themselves are horrific and nobody ever wants to see these things happen, the denial not only just erases the crimes themselves, but really completes the othering process. By denying these events took place, you are not only denying the experience of the individuals, you're denying the experience of the groups, you're denying the fact that these people have been excluded, they've been othered, they've been persecuted, which again, just completes this othering process. It reinforces the othering process and makes sure that these individuals cannot become part of the majority group. Keep in mind that each of the 10 stages don't necessarily need to occur in a linear order, which is something that Stanton makes very clear. While all the stages are important, what I'm going to kind of focus on a little bit in terms of thinking about the role the criminal justice system might play is the first four, and number, which is classification, civilization, discrimination, dehumanization, and then number 6 and number 8, which is the polarization and the persecution. These stages, I think, are among the most important in the labeling process, the othering process. And in this sense, we're talking about the criminalization as part of the othering process, not just simply defining groups as others, the us versus them, but actually transitioning it over from an us versus them to an actual state of these are not just others, but they are criminals, and they are criminals simply because they are not like us. It's not that they have committed murder. It's not that they have committed rape. It's not that they've committed robbery, but because they are an other class, it by default makes them criminal, and their acts are criminal. And because they are now put in this criminal group, not only do they lose their citizenship, lose their basic voting rights, we then tolerate all sorts of discrimination and limitations placed on their freedoms, fines, imprisonment, and ultimately, in the case of genocide, we tolerate the deaths of these groups because they have been placed in the other criminalization category. In a sense, by the time we hit the end and we hit the genocide part of it, what results in actual deaths of people, it's almost as if parts of society are okay with it because these individuals had been so othered to the degree of criminalization that they are no longer viewed as worthy. And in fact, the extermination, the elimination of these groups suddenly becomes something that fits right in with the notions of justice. It's a horrible perversion of what justice is intended to be. I'm going to start with the Holocaust, and I can probably give you, I'm going to talk about other things, but the Holocaust, again, as the classic example of a genocide. And, we talk a lot about how to keep Holocaust education alive and how to ensure moving forward that the Holocaust education has a lot of relevance. And I really think that just starting from the basics makes sense. And so I'm going to go through just a couple of things with respect to this. I'm trying to be cognizant of my time, and I'm sure Dr. Alai will hit me up if I go too long, because I do have a tendency to wander a little bit. I get lost in my own thoughts. But I want to talk about the Holocaust for a few minutes. And, one of the things that I find with most of my students is that they know what the Holocaust is, or at least they think they know what the Holocaust is. They have a very vague understanding. Every school has taught them something somewhere about it. But when we really start to talk about the Holocaust in terms of the stages of genocide, and we go through it step by step by step, and we put it in the context of history, it starts to trigger something in their brain. And it becomes almost like history becomes alive, because then they start to look and they say, well, if this is what happened to the Jews in Germany, well, what about this situation? And what about this situation? And what about what's going on today? And how do we then apply what we've learned? It's a practical application of the knowledge. And again, I think we would be remiss, I hate to say this as granted of Holocaust survivors, but this is the quintessential genocide right now. There's a ton of research out there. We have so many resources, especially with everything going online now. I've been able to provide my students with stuff that I was never able to provide them before. And there's so much stuff that is continuing to emerge that it is very much a living history in a way that other things are not, even as survivors are maybe dying. And we're, I heard a blip on the radio today that the State Department has announced that they are no longer pursuing any Nazi fugitives living in the United States. They're deporting the last person. She's 95 years old. She was a secretary in one of the concentration camps. So we're definitely seeing a transition, but the technology has just made things so much different. There's so much literature. I'm going to talk a little about the Holocaust and the stages, but in addition, I'm also going to mention that it's not just about the legacy of the genocide, but it's also kind of a legacy of mistrust, abuse, and harm. In the modern United States, we really have no concept in the modern United States of what it is to have a genocide. I know Laura mentioned at the start Turtle Island, and I think we are starting to recognize some things, but even that has not really hit the mainstream academic world yet. There are a lot of people who have no idea what Turtle Island is, let alone the repercussions of what it was. And so for many of us, understanding a genocide and understanding the othering process, we almost need to take the worst example of the othering process to understand things that have happened in our own history. The first stage we're talking about is classification. All cultures and communities have a means of differentiating us versus them. These aren't necessarily always harmful distinctions, but sometimes we just need them as human beings. We need them to be able to classify our lives. But even these benign classifications that aren't necessarily intended to be harmful, maybe they're just there to help bolster a group's identity, or kind of a way to help people self-identify, ensure their well-being, self-worth, but not necessarily the intent to harm others. Ultimately, what happens is the classification does end up resulting in the more harmful us versus them mentality, if not kind of kept in check. The next stage is the symbolization. And again, these stages aren't necessarily linear. Symbolization is attaching names or symbols to classifications. And again, this isn't necessarily a harmful thing. I kind of think about it in terms of like, everyone knows what, the road sign for a hospital looks like. Churches, synagogues, if you're looking for a place to worship, you find the thing with the Jewish star, chances are it's a synagogue. You find the thing with the cross outside, chances are it is a place where if you're Christian or Catholic, you can go worship. Symbols aren't necessarily, again, inherently evil. And again, they help foster group identity. They help people recognize people who might have the same cultural interests with them. But if left unchecked, if taken to the extreme, again, can create problems. Symbols become a shorthand for group identity, which again, isn't necessarily a bad thing, except when they become used in a negative way. When they become symbols which become the use of others. We use them to help not just self-identify or self-affiliate, but to use it as an us versus them in the othering process. The most common example when we talk about the Holocaust is the yellow star, which I'll come back to in a minute. When groups come to rely heavily on the us versus them as part of the classification and symbolization, we end up with the discrimination. Discrimination is the means by which dominant groups use laws, customs, political power to deny the rights of other groups. This could include removal of partial or full civil rights, voting rights, citizenship, and is mainly driven by this exclusionary ideology. It may not necessarily be a genocidal ideology, at least not initially, but it is very much the othering that we want to keep these people out of our communities. We want to keep them out of our politics. We want to keep them out of our realm of thought because they are somehow inferior. The dehumanization process is the process by which the other group is denied its humanity, often equated with animals, vermin, insects, impurity, dirt, filth, immorality, which allows for the public to overcome what should be a basic human revulsion for mistreating people and undermining somebody's humanity. The polarization is the means by which to further drive groups apart using propaganda, mass media, and the legal system. The extremists of the dominant groups not only set the stage for other groups to be further vilified and criminalized, but also to vilify those who speak out in support of the other. Those who speak out in any way for the other group are categorized as a direct threat, and their actions are qualified as illegal and punished as such. The persecution aspects vary broadly, but often call upon the judiciary and the criminal justice system to do its bidding. And I'm going to come back to Nazi Germany specifically in a minute. I know it's worth saying, but I mentioned this, and you mentioned this again. Again, these stages are not necessarily linear. And I apologize if this was too much of a review for some of you who are already familiar with this. But I feel for those of you who weren't, I think it's worth just going over it. The Nazis, as I started to mention, were the ultimate perverters of justice. They used words like justice, criminal justice, laws. Many students fail to realize that Hitler just didn't show up one day and walk into the Reichstag and suddenly take over. That much of what Hitler did was using the existing political system, using existing laws, manipulating in a way that is just horrifying for anybody who's a true believer in justice. But it wasn't necessarily initially by brute force. And once he had the control, he was able to pervert things that should have been there to protect human beings, to protect especially the others, because the way we view the criminal justice system today, especially we talk about protected classes, even when we talk about our individuals who are incarcerated, we talk about them as a protected class of people who still need an extra sort of protection. The Nazis flipped this on its head and perverted these ideas. The idea of protective custody is totally manipulated by the Nazi regime and is totally not what we think of today. Just a quick sort of thought on the history of the Jews. I read something recently where, they were talking about how could such a cultured, seemingly democratic society have created the Nazis and the Holocaust, and the response that is, almost shocking but appropriate is, but for, you needed a society that was this cultured, that was this democratic, that was this advanced, that was this enlightened in order to create something like the Holocaust. The mechanisms, the legal minds, the judiciary, the paperwork, the kind of forethought, the planning is something that you wouldn't have necessarily seen in other places. It's not to say, Hitler took advantage of what was there, but he did it in such a genius way in some respects. He manipulated the systems that were there to preserve and protect the others, to protect society, to ensure that everybody lived within a safe system, and perverted it for his own agenda. The history of anti-Semitism in Europe far predates the Nazis. For hundreds of years in Europe, Jews were placed into different categories, separated others. And so the othering of the Jews of Europe was not something created by Hitler. What it was is he was able to take advantage of some of the othering that already existed. Some of the initial stages predate history. The idea of othering, you can go back, some of the pictures that are up on your screen now highlight different things that were used to separate Jews going back centuries. While the yellow star with the Jude in the middle is probably the most well-known symbol of the Holocaust, although it wasn't actually used in all areas under Nazi control. The Nazis were not the first to force Jews to wear a badge of identification. The first documented use of a badge of identification comes from the Muslims in the 8th century. Both Jews and Christians in Muslim countries in that time were forced to wear usually belts of a different color. And it wasn't necessarily for punitive measures. Sometimes these individuals were, the justification was they could be identified as people of the books and were provided some sort of protection when it came to it. The tradition, by the way, of having Jews wear some sort of colored belt in some Middle Eastern countries prevailed until very recently. And there's some, if you talk about customs in Jewish dress, some of them have just become so integral that, people forget why it was originally put in there. During the Middle Ages, it was common for Jews to wear identification symbols. Under papal order, European countries, various European countries, Jews were forced to wear identifying badges. 1275, King Edward of England directed that all Jews over the age of 7 wear yellow taffeta 6 fingers long and 3 broads wide over the left chest of their outer garment. Very specific, right? The Jew hat, which is identified in some of these pictures, is something that's kind of made itself into Jewish storytelling and Jewish mythology. But it was instituted in medieval Germany as a requirement to be able to identify Jews. And, this is not a lecture on anti-Semitism or sort of the roots of that, but this notion that Jews were already others before Hitler came to power. And that is something to keep in mind. The use of symbols, even though a lot of these requirements of Jews to wear certain hats or certain badges disappear by the 1800s, by the 18th, 19th century, they're not necessarily required. They are commonly found in literature, in art, in common storytelling, common mythology, depictions. The legacy is still there. And it's not really surprising that when Hitler comes to power and he picks an other, he uses the same means that this community was othered to other them. His views are perhaps more malicious than some of the other ones, but he definitely others them. And, you can argue or discuss or debate whether or not, Hitler might have been as successful had this othering of Jews not already existed. The otherings of Jews in terms of, the symbols, the classifications, the us versus them. Jews in parts of Europe had lived in ghettos for periods of time prior to Hitler. Hitler did not invent the word ghetto. And in some sense, certain Jewish communities across, especially Eastern Europe, actually chose to self-isolate because they had experienced discrimination. They had experienced other things that resulted from the initial othering and felt better in their self-isolation. I'm going to kind of skip ahead again because this is not a lecture and I'm not even sure how much time I've used at this point. But again, somebody will cut me off when I'm getting close.
You've got about 10 minutes, Celia.
Perfect. Thank you.
Sure.
I'm going to jump forward a little bit. Nuremberg Laws 1935 is like the ultimate perversion of the criminal justice system, the ultimate perversion of the legal system. 1935, Jews are not only stripped of their Jewish citizenship, but there are numerous clauses that criminalize their activities, their basic rights, their social rights, basic activities. And one might think, well, okay, it's one thing to pass laws, it's another thing to enforce them. But not only did the Nazis embark on this sort of paper pencil othering, making laws that isolated Jews, they were gung-ho about enforcing them. The othering process of Jews was, from the second Hitler hit power, with a small break for the Olympics, just because, world optics were looking on. The Nazis really actively engaged in this othering process. Jews were often referred to as Nazi propaganda as vermin or source of spreading diseases. Jews were presented as immoral, unethical, and pure. The process was designed to further create an us versus them dynamic, as well as a means to ensure Jews would be continued to be viewed in a negative manner. The polarization that resulted in Nazi Germany was such that the sort of mixing in Jews and non-Jews was not just frowned upon socially, but was actually illegal, right? We have lots of instances of prosecutions, criminal prosecutions of individuals for having sexual contact between Jews and non-Jews, even if without proof. A number of these cases resulted in harsh punishments for the individuals. Individuals were assumed to be guilty until proven innocent, and being proven innocent was, the mere suspicion meant you weren't innocent, and it created this almost kangaroo courts that just undermines what was supposed to happen. There's a lot of literature out there that talks about how the judiciary really could have stopped Hitler, or at least slowed him down at some points. But rather than act to slow him down or prevent him from doing what he was doing, not only did they follow the laws, not only did they work to enact them, they actually broadened them and showed a good deal of support for it. Part of the reason is that after the Reichstag fire, Hitler basically finds ways to oust anybody who isn't politically loyal to him. And once everybody who's loyal to him is sitting there passing the laws, and they're the judges and they're the prosecutors and they're the defense attorneys and they're everybody who's involved, it becomes much easier for him to manipulate the process. Early on, there were people who spoke out against, not necessarily in support of the Jews, but in terms of the manipulation of the criminal justice system. And those individuals were very quickly deemed enemies of the state, quickly sent away to concentration camps. Dachau exists pretty early on in Nazi history for politically undesirables, people who are threats to the existence of Germany. The fact that Hitler took it upon himself to even sit there and put into law who is a Jew based on their genetics, this is the ultimate othering. Previous anti-Jewish laws largely depended on not necessarily birth as Jew, who your parents were, but focused a great deal on what your religious beliefs were. And so there was almost, I don't want to say a way out of it because that's not the right term, but there was a way, you converted to Christianity, you secularized yourself, you made it not so noticeable, you could walk away and you could become part of the mainstream and you could avoid the othering. It wasn't necessarily a biological thing. What Hitler did is he basically turned it so that there was really no escaping this othering. Hundreds of people, thousands of people who had no religious affiliations, who had no desire, who had never self-identified as Jews, based on the Nazis' definition of who were Jews, suddenly found themselves Jews and found themselves othered. People who had thought, especially in Germany, people who had become who thought of themselves as more German than Jews, suddenly found them in this othered position. And it was such a shock to them. And they didn't know how to quite process this information, but the laws were very much enforced. And you see, there between 1939 and 1933, 1939, Nazis passed over 400 different laws limiting the social, political, cultural, educational, professional activities of Jews simply because they're Jews. These are some of the pictures. You can see some of the headlines from American papers, right? Purge of Nazi foes is gaining ineptness, Jewish chief victims. Hitler deprives citizenships, bans intermarriage, Reich pays Jews back in the Middle Ages. You see some of the propaganda posters, the idea that Jews now had to have the J on their passport, changing of the names that most of us are familiar with. Some of these laws that pass are things that we're very familiar with, right? No sexual interaction between Jews and non-Jews. Jews couldn't employ a female servant. But some of these laws start to look a little crazy, maybe a little like, why did somebody write a law like this? Jews are not allowed to own gardens. All streets in Germany are renamed if they have Jewish names. Jews are prohibited from cinemas, Oscars, concerts, right? Kosher slaughter is prohibited. Sports laws prohibiting Jewish boxers in public swimming. It is the ultimate othering. It is creating a whole separate society. Jews expelled from all sorts of professions. Veterinary laws. Jews can't be veterinarians anymore. Guns. Jews are not allowed to own guns anymore. And that's a whole separate issue in terms of current Jewish thoughts on gun control and the legacy that kind of that law in and of itself leaves in terms of the lasting effect. Anything to exclude Jews from other countries. And while Nazi Germany does this, and of course this then applies to all the lands that they conquer directly, many of their allies and countries that they support who maybe aren't 100% allies gladly take on these roles themselves. They create these laws, they pass very similar things to different degrees. But it wasn't just like somebody came along and posted a poster and said, this is it today. They actually used the legal system that we would typically think of as a legislature putting through a law and then use the courts to enforce it. Not only did they just enforce it flippantly, they really actually strongly enforced it. Nazi Germany in the 30s is often referred to as a police state. And one of the things I often discuss with my students is because we hear the term police state floated around a lot today, that we live in a police state, given what is going on in our country now, what's been going on in our country for the last 5 years with politics, with COVID, with vaccine mandates, all this stuff. And we really talk about what it really means to be a police state. This notion that, under the Nazi regime, the role of the police is fully redefined. Police are given broad powers to search, arrest, incarcerate anyone perceived correctly or incorrectly to be an enemy of the state, anyone considered to be criminal. Jews, because of their status as Jews, were considered the enemy number one, and subject to all of these broad powers and actions. Police in Germany and across Europe used persecution of Jews and others who the Nazis deemed as undesirable. These officers were often used as part of mass searches, deportations of Jews, take key supportive roles, and at times active roles working with the SS and the Gestapo. The crimes of many of these people arrested by police in the country were simply crimes of being Jewish or engaging in any of those lists of forbidden activities. The security police, the Gestapo, the Kripo, the criminal police, were charged with inflicting the Nazi reign of terror. These groups were empowered to use protective and custody, which today is supposed to be actually a good thing, to incarcerate anybody they deemed as a threat indefinitely without charges or trial. Those being held had no right to a lawyer to appeal their status. The police, as well as the security police, were given unlimited surveillance and search abilities. Suspicion of engaging behavior deemed antisocial can be subject to police scrutiny and authority. Habitual criminal statutes, which were not necessarily used against Jews, but could be also used against Jews, became the norm. Detention facilities began to fill up, not just with enemies of the state like Jews, but political groups and criminals. The emergence of the concentration camps as a holding place for these individuals. In the early days, you could kind of get out of a concentration camp, but it would almost be what you weren't freed. You had to leave the country, or you were subject to what we call terms of parole today. It was a just ultimate bastardization of a system that is, yes, in some instances is designed to be punitive, but in most senses and the vast majority of approaches is designed to be rehabilitative. I've probably spent, I'm running out of time. In the last few minutes, I just kind of want to talk about, something that my students always point out. They always talk about slavery, and they always talk about, we always talk about the legacy of slavery and what the legacy of slavery has meant for current terms of incarceration. And there's a ton of literature that talks about the fact that in the aftermath of slavery and how freed slaves were treated, especially down south, where, kind of the simple version of this is the South lost its labor. All of their free labor now disappear. You still have plantations to run. You have to rebuild the South. There's railroads that need to be built. All this stuff has to happen. Where's this labor coming from? Well, okay, you can hire your now freed slaves to work for you. But if you're the plantation owner, if you're the railroad owner, you really want to pay those people a fair wage? No. And what we see down south in the aftermath of slavery is peonage laws. We see peonage. We see, even though peonage is technically illegal, even though many of these things were technically illegal on the books, many jurisdictions start to pass things known as pig laws, things that are deliberately aimed at targeting freed slaves because of their otherness, and the fact that they wear their otherness. There's no way to hide their otherness. Arrested for being on the street after a certain amount of time, for failing to pay a bill, for speaking back to somebody, all of these things, and they result in incarceration. And down south, it doesn't necessarily result in incarceration per se, as we understand it today, but what it results in is prison labor. Many of these freed slaves are returned to the plantations where they were freed from to work as prison laborers. Not paid, not anything. There's a huge body of literature in criminal justice that talks about how the othering as a result of slavery has long-lasting legacies today in terms of policing, in terms of corrections, in terms of equal sentencing. Do African Americans in the criminal justice system today get treated the same way whites do? And the simple answer to that is no. The bigger question is why? And many scholars point back to this legacy of slavery. And going back to for 10 stages of genocide that I talked about at the beginning, we can kind of see the early stages of genocide. Pre-COVID, I took a group of students a number of years ago on a tour of the Holocaust Museum as part of our class. And one student said to me, wait a minute, there's a Holocaust museum. Why isn't there a slavery museum? And it started a very interesting conversation on how does slavery fit into the 10 stages of genocide? Do we see the same active level of killing that occurred, the extermination that occurred in the Holocaust? Absolutely not. Do we see a legacy of things that could have turned that way? Absolutely. The discrimination, the classification, the dehumanization, the symbolization, all of those things are still there, and they have not disappeared. I just want to get in one more kind of more modern thing in the United States, again, because we in the United States have not experienced a full genocide in modern history. And in many respects, we have not, because we have been able to catch ourselves, not always quick enough, but we try to find ways to fix these things. And I think many Holocaust institutions are now focused on this, which is a wonderful thing because it's the living legacy of the Holocaust. It is the living legacy of what happened. One of the things that I had the privilege of participating in a year ago was a educational seminar on, educating students about the history of the LGBTQ community, QTI community, and the discrimination that they faced. And what many people fail to realize that up until the 1980s, homosexual activity was illegal. Like illegal, you could be arrested for what you did in your house in many places. Those laws were still on the books. Maybe they hadn't been acted upon for many years, but it wasn't until the 1980s that many of these states eliminated these laws. We know about the Stonewall riots. Hopefully we know about the Stonewall riots, right? NYPD versus gay protesters fighting for the rights, people who were arrested, entrapment, manipulations of the criminal justice system to the ends of what? To punishing people, to othering people. We hear about stuff going on in Russia, about the othering, about how gay people are treated. There's so much going on in the world today. My students always say, well, we talk about never again, right? That's like our mantra for the Holocaust is never again. But yet there were things after that, and there still continue to be things.
Celia, I think we have, sorry to interrupt. I think that might be a good way to stop, a good place to.
Sorry,
yeah.
I always go over. My apologies.
No worries. I think the modern day applications are really resonant. The images are always really powerful as well. A couple of questions to kind of wrap this up. You identified earlier that you went through the stages of genocide, and it seems like this concept of othering is embedded in virtually every stage. Could you elaborate on or reflect on what could potentially be red flags in a culture that is maybe undergoing that process of othering particular groups? So for instance, are the red flags the stages, or are there other potential processes, or let's say rhetoric or media depictions, or maybe things that are happening within a culture that could serve as red flags that it seems like maybe this group is vulnerable, or this might be a particular group that's potentially going to be targeted or othered within this society?
So I think that's an excellent question. And I can give you kind of the simple answer. I think some of this is a little bit above my pay grade, as we say. But for example, the map that's on there comes from, it talks about, in 2021, what countries are high at risk for genocide. And, one of the nice things, I guess, I don't know if that's the right word, about the stages of genocide is that every stage that there is the potential for intervention, there is the potential for prevention. And there are definitely flags. We have to be hyper aware of what is out there. Again, there's nothing necessarily wrong with a symbol. There's nothing necessarily wrong with self-identifying as a group. But when the rhetoric switches, when it starts to put the other as the villain, the other as the evil, the other as the cause of your harm, that is where you start to see it. And, part of it is it's okay to have othering in society, but you have to have institutions that transcend racial and ethnic divides. And you can still be others, but still integrate and still interact and integrate with others. And I think that is my biggest thought about this, right? Is you need to, you can be other, but you can't be other in a bubble. Right.
Yeah. When you were going through alluding to the concentration camp system, for instance, I started to think about, while obviously anti-Semitism and targeting of Jews was central to Nazi ideology, we know that there were a lot of other persecuted groups within the concentration camp systems as well, such as LGBTQ that you mentioned at the end. And you talked about political prisoners even before Jewish people were rounded up. What I also wanted to ask is there a widening scope of who is othered once a culture starts persecuting groups? Or in other words, for instance, today it might be one group that's being persecuted under a given regime. But if we allow that persecution to go kind of unrivaled, is it then going to turn into other groups which are other down the line, which seems very consistent with what happened under the Nazi regime?
And I think you're 100% right about that. And I think because it wears down our tolerance. Once we are
Right.
willing to accept the dehumanization of one group,
Right.
and the pattern is established, we are willing to think about it. And, in contrast to the Jews and to the Jehovah's Witnesses and everything else, I think about the Tiergarten program, right? Which was legal. They put in the laws to be able to.
And could you explain that for maybe our students who
So the
aren't familiar
Tiergarten
with it?
program, basically pre targeting the Jews exclusively early on in Nazi Germany, they targeted people with mental, physical disabilities in institutions. And they would basically, your loved one would be in an institution, they would be doing fine. And suddenly you get a letter from the German government that says, we're very sorry, your relative has died of pneumonia. But what they were actually doing is they were euthanizing these individuals
Right.
against the wishes of the families, against the wishes of the community. But the difference, I think, there, and what people talk about, the difference, eventually the Nazis had to stop that program,
Yeah.
at least in the broad sense, because there was a human component to it. There wasn't an other, because it was my father, my sister, my mother, my cousin. They weren't an other. I knew them. They were personal to me. And people started to speak out about it and actively speak out about it.
And they were also German.
Right. So, but it made a big difference. But the
Yeah.
laws had been set up. They had set it up so it was perfectly legal. What they did by euthanizing, the manipulation of nursing staff and doctors, like there was a very clear, nothing about it was illegal, nothing about it was unethical, nothing about it was immoral. They had very clearly laid it out, but yet they were forced to stop when people said, these are not others, these are mine. And that's a very big component of it. And it makes a big difference.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. We talk in my classes about what can we do to cultivate an all-inclusive orientation, or to kind of extend the boundaries between us and them, so that even if, like you mentioned, it's not inherently a bad thing to affiliate with a given group, right? Or to identify with a particular quality. But if that's then used as a dividing mark or a separation, or now I'm looking at you differently because you don't belong in that group, for instance, then that could potentially be a catalyst for greater risk and things like that. So what can we do kind of collectively to expand the boundaries so that even if your group affiliation is different from mine, there's still a bridge between us, and we're still able to recognize our kind of common interests and common humanity and things like that.
Right. And I think that that's part of the living legacy of the Holocaust. People are talking about Holocaust studies sort of dying with the survivors, but I don't think that that's the case, because I think once you start the discussion, other people, it inevitably happens. I'm sure the same thing in your class is, as we start to talk about these things, somebody will raise their hand and say, well, my family is Armenian, or, my family is from here. My family is, from South America. My family is from these countries. And my students are shocked. They don't, I introduce the Uyghurs to them. It's just, it's a mind blowing to them that, wait, but we didn't learn our lessons. And then it's like, wait, but who are these people and why are they being targeted? Why don't I know about them? Why don't I know anything about who they are? But, one of my students said to me the other day, well, this makes sense. They're others. I don't care about what happens to the Uyghurs or the Yazidis. They're not me. They're not Americans. They're not in my country.
Right.
They are other. Who cares? Obviously, not. They should care. That was the point. But
right. Absolutely.
But
Absolutely.
it puts the othering in a very clear. They have no common language with us. We don't share a common culture. We don't share. The only thing that we really share in common with them is that we're human beings who are entitled to basic human fundamental rights.
Absolutely. I think that's a great way to end. Thank you. And again, Dr. Celia Spora, for those of you who've had the pleasure already in enrolling in courses with her. And for those of you who don't, if this is your first FaceTime, now it's another faculty member that we get to know. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
I also just wanted to say thank you, Dr. Spora. Thank you, Dr. Alai. This has been really illuminating. And I think also just focusing on us versus them is very important. And the position constantly changes. And I think that right now, we were talking before the event about how so much of Holocaust history is being distorted and being used for nefarious purposes, right? There's an image circulating right now using Arbach McFry, the ominous gate that greeted prisoners heading into Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp in Dachau as well, and distorting it to talk about vaccines. And so by being able to look critically at when are we us, when are we them, I think is really, really important as we head into these very unstable political times. So I wanted to thank everyone for attending. Please check out the KHC's website for more information on our upcoming events, as well as to virtually visit our exhibition on the concentration camp system. Take care, be safe, stay well. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you again.